Hey guys, welcome back to another SAPP programming lecture. This is the comprehensive Java review course that seeks to cover everything from your basic system print statement to advanced Java hash maps. Today we're going to be learning about loops, but before we get into it, I'd like to make a couple announcements. I'd actually like to introduce the SAPP Google site, which we have recently developed. Now, this site will give you guys a little more insight into our purpose here at SAPP. And we even have various coding challenges for you guys to try out so that you can improve your coding skills. Also, SAPP has started its first Instagram page, and we can give you guys daily updates, and you guys can even give us suggestions as to what we can do better or probably new topics that we can cover. I'm not sure about you guys, but for me, today is a beautiful day to write some code. So without further ado, let's have some fun learning about loops. Now, loops is another basic concept that you will find yourself using a lot when you start writing in-depth Java code. They're almost like a method that will allow you to do a certain action multiple times without having to rewrite the statement multiple times. They're like a method because they're written with brackets instead of semicolons so that you can insert your actions or your code between the curly brackets. And loops play a huge role in code refactoring. Code refactoring is nothing but simply simplifying your code without changing its entire purpose. If this seems confusing, don't worry about it. We'll go over an example later. There are three main types of loops. We have the for loop, the while loop, and underneath this little tab here, we have the do while loop. Now, first, let's go over the for loop. The for loop is probably the most commonly used loop and probably the most elaborate, meaning that there's more code involved, as you can see over here in an example. In for loops, you can code a command that will execute for a certain number of times, which you'll be able to change, of course. So this is what the average for loop looks like. We have the for here to specify that it's a kind of loop, and that it's a for loop. And then we have this whole thing going on here in the parentheses. Now, this part is really important because it will influence how many times your loop will run. It will influence, in this case, how many times the system will print, hey. And to determine how many times you want the computer to run the code in your loop, you're going to have to do what's called Initialization Condition and Increment/Decrement. As you can see, these three parts are separated into three different Java statements, as shown by the semicolon. The first statement, the initialization, is where you initialize a variable, which means nothing but making a variable and giving it a value. The second statement, the condition, can be identified by an inequality sign, as shown right here. And the third statement, which is the increment decrement, can be represented by like a plus or a minus sign. But what's the importance of these specific statements? That question can actually be best answered through coding. So let's take a moment away from our lecture and go into the Eclipse environment. So I'm in the SAPP folder right here. Let's go into the basics package. And I'm going to create a loops class. So new, this green little class icon right here. Let's just call it loops. Oh, as you can see, I forgot to put in the main method, but that really shouldn't be a problem because Eclipse has a built-in shortcut, and that is just type in main, and if you hit Control space, you get the main method down here, and just hit enter. There you go, you have your main method. So now that we have our main method, let's start off by writing a loop that will print the numbers 1 through 10. And let's write for. Let me actually add a space here, and we wrote for. And we want to print our numbers starting from 1. So our first statement, which is the initialization, we'll call it int I equals 1. Okay? And then we want to go to 10, because remember, we're trying to print numbers 1 through 10. So let's do I less than 11. So what the computer will do is that it will start off at 1, and then it will keep on performing the action. And this is actually my mistake. I forgot to put in the curly brackets here, but it will start at 1, and then it will continue to execute the command, which is going to be in here, until it reaches the highest number, less than 11, which is 10. Now we can actually write this another way and still have the same thing happen. Instead of I less than 11, we can do I less than or equal to 10. So what this will do is that instead of going to the greatest number less than 11, it will just go to 10, which is automatically the greatest number. And then finally we have the increment and the decrement. But what exactly is the difference between these two terms? So an increment is where you increase the value of I. Each time the loop runs, I gets bigger and bigger. Increment basically means adding. So to correctly format an increment, you can do I++, which is just a shortcut for add 1 to I each time the loop runs through. Or you can do something like I equals I plus 2. And, that's 1 plus 2, I plus 2. And this will basically add 2 to I each time the code runs. So if you want to print odd numbers, this would actually be the proper increment. Decrement reduces the value of I each time the loop runs. So it's basically subtraction. Think of it sort of like the opposite of increment. So we can do I minus minus or I equals to I minus 2. Now there are two unique things about the increment and decrement that you have to keep in mind whenever you're writing them. Well, one is that you don't need a semicolon like the initialization and the condition, but you also need to identify which one you want to use. Do I want to use increment or do I want to use decrement? So let's think about this for a second. We are going from 1 through 10. So we want the value of I to increase each time, right? So that means we need to use increment, meaning that I will get bigger and bigger each time. So we want to print every value of I, right? So that means we need I plus plus. So now that we have our loop set up, we just need to tell the computer to print it. And how we can do this is just, our sysout shortcut, control space. And I suggest that you pause right here and figure it out on your own, because in my opinion, that's the best way to learn. And if you get it wrong, that's okay. The worst thing that will happen is that the computers will say there's an error. And if you just can't get it, then you can come back to the video. Anyway, we want to write the sysout statement, and in the parentheses, we will print I. So let's run it. And as you can see, this is exactly what we wanted. So now let's recap and look closely at our source code. So we have the main method, obviously, and then we have this for loop. Remember, there are 3 statements in the for loop. We have the initialization, condition, and the increment or decrement. Now for me, that's actually a mouthful, so normally I say first, second, and third statement. You guys can say the same thing if you want. Now, we wanted the computer to print the numbers 1 through 10, right? And we could have just done this using only sysout statements. So we could have done system.print1. And then we could have copied this, pasted this, just done this 10 times, and then just change each number to 2, and then 3, and then so on and so forth. But that is actually a huge no-no in the programming world. Let me actually undo all of this. So this is not only redundant and boring, but this is actually using a lot of memory space that your source code is taking up. Instead of writing all these sysout statements, you can just simply write a for loop that does the exact same thing, and that is what code refactoring is, if you remember that we mentioned earlier in our lecture. You're just making slight adjustments in your code so that it's more concise, but the overall purpose and behavior does not change. You still get the numbers 1 through 10, and you could also get 1 through 10 using sysout statements, but it's better if you use a loop because you use less memory space and it's less redundant. Let me show you another example. So let's forward here. We have this for loop, right? It starts from 0 and then it goes to 5, and it'll print hey 5 times. Now, if we look at this little string of sysout methods over here, it does the exact same thing, but that is still a huge no-no in the coding world, as for the reasons explained earlier. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video right here. Keep your eyes open for the next lecture where we finish our loop section by covering while and do while. Thanks for watching, guys, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and let your friends know about us by sharing. Have an amazing day.